Hey guys, this is Rob King, coming to you from my house. So last on Tuesday, we tried to record this lesson in person, and even though the lesson went really well, the camera decided to die halfway through. And instead of trying, of just skipping a week or trying to salvage that recording, I decided that maybe I would try and do this in person. So I'm going to give this a go, and we'll see how it goes. So, the last several weeks have been focused on attacking chess. So we looked at Bobby Fischer versus Pal Benko and a nice, Rook sacrifice on f6. We looked at Geller's masterpiece against Smyslov, and we looked at a Nesmazhinov game and also a game of my own. But they were all focused on strong attacking chess and sacrifices, queen sacrifices, flashy stuff. But before that gets old, I wanted to focus on maybe some more positional chess and kind of round out some chess thinking here. And when I was trying to come up with the right material for this, I came across this wonderful game between Juda Polgar from Hungary and Vichy Anand from the Hugevens tournament. So it's Wijk aan Zee, which is currently going on right now, but this game was played in 1998. So Polgar, so everybody knows who Vichy Anand is, but Juda Polgar, maybe not everybody knows who she is, but she's the strongest woman chess player to ever live. Definitely had a rating well over 2,700, and actually was top 10 in the world at some point. She's beaten all of the top players in the world. She's an absolutely fantastic chess player, as are both of her sisters. So she's actually most known, I think, for her aggressive attacking play as well. But this game will show that the top players all have this ability to play very methodical, efficient positional chess. So let's take a look at this game and discuss some of the main themes and plans that I'd like you to learn about. So the game starts off as a typical Najdorf Sicilian, where black plays e5, and we get this typical setup. And here let's pause and understand maybe what both sides are playing for here. So it's very clear that white has this very nice hole on d5 that they would love to sink their pieces into it. And if we think about what is the best piece for white to sink into there, it's probably very clearly a knight. So from d5, a knight would be able to attack all the dark squares, all the dark squares in the black camp, but also control other important dark squares in white's camp as well. I mean, it would be what's considered like an octopus. It's just wreaking havoc all over the board. So white would love to be able to sink a knight into this square when it's not able to be traded off. So that's actually going to be our strategic plan for the entire game as white. Black, they would love to do a few things. So black would like to, maybe expand on the queen side, play a move like b5, just gain space on the queen side. They have a half open c file, so they'd like to maybe put their queen onto c7, a rook onto c8, and maybe start putting some pressure on the c2 square. They'd also like, if possible, and probably this is their main objective if they can, is to play the move d5 themselves. And so the reason that they would like to play d5 themselves is so that the pawn on d6 it's not so weak right now because there's no way for white to really attack it and cause problems. But it is a backward pawn. No pawn can defend it. And maybe in the long term, it can be a strategic weakness, especially if white is able to firmly plant a piece on d5. Then this pawn can be a long-term weakness, and as well the bishop on e7 will become permanently bad because all of the pawns for black in the center will be on dark squares. So the the dark square bishop will find a very hard time finding work if they can't maybe achieve d5 or find a way to trade off this dark square bishop. So this game is actually going to focus on this struggle in particular of how do we fight for that d5 square. And let's actually think even a little bit more before we proceed. What does white actually want to do in order to fight for that square? So when we talk about fighting for squares, what we'd like to do is make sure that black is maybe not left with any pieces that can control d5, like no minor pieces. If black gives an exchange on this square, like a rook for a knight or rook for a bishop, we're probably happy because the position is not super closed and the rooks might exert a lot of influence. So what we'd like to do is be left with a position where we have a very strong white knight on d5 against this dark squared bishop. Any other imbalance, you're able to actually trade the pieces off. So for instance, if it's a knight on d5 versus some other knight, black will be able to challenge that knight by maybe rerouting to f6. If a knight is against the light square bishop, then the light square bishop can simply come to e6 and trade off on d5. But the dark squared bishop is unable to actually fight against this knight on d5. So not only are we fighting for the square d5, we're actually fighting to get a very particular piece imbalance. And you'll see what happens in this game. You'll understand why it's so strong to get this imbalance after this. So in order to achieve that, we need to come up with kind of a high-level, long-term strategic plan. What we'd like to do is find a way just to trade off the other three minor pieces. So right now, we can actually think of how to achieve this. I mean, if we get to make many moves in a row, we'd like to maybe move our bishop to g5 so we can exchange the knight on f6 for this bishop. Even though bishops are good, we want to trade off any piece that controls d5. So this is part of our plan, and we actually do this in the game. We'd like to find a way that when the black's knight on b8 comes into the game, either through b6 or through f6, that we play knight d5, trade off those knights, and take back on d5 with a piece. And then we'd also like to find a way to trade off the light squared bishops in a favorable way. So not like taking on e6 where the f pawn would control d5, but finding another way. And in this game, black actually helps us a little bit with this, and it's a type of mistake that it's very subtle and surprising for a high-level player like Anand to make, but it's not so surprising to see these types of moves happen at the class level and even expert level. So this will be a really instructive game. So why don't we actually just continue a little bit more and see how this plays out in a real game. So black, per our plan, they're trying to fight for the d5 square, so they immediately develop their piece to e6 so they can challenge the square and also put a question to the bishop, do you want to trade for me? Or are you going to retreat, and which diagonal are you going to retreat to? So here, it's very clearly bad for us to take on e6, so black can play fe6. Now they have the half-open f file, and they're also going to be able to play d5 much easier and get rid of this weakness on d6. The bishop on e7 becomes much stronger. So this is clearly a horrible mistake. We can defend our bishop, which is what Polgar decided, or we could play bishop b3, typical kind of move. But what white would like to do here is make moves with intention and with tempo. So just retreating the bishop gives black almost a free move, whereas the move that Polgar plays, queen to e2, what this does is also, as well as defending the bishop, it prepares to put a rook onto d1. And white would welcome this trade on c4 because it would give away one of the pieces that is fighting for d5. So if you remember at the beginning, I said that we'd love to find a way to exchange light square bishops in a favorable way. So there's no way that black will do this. At least so you would think. So black continues with b5. So again, fighting, they're expanding on the queen side. And it actually has another potential idea that it introduces into the position of b4. which would again fight for the d5 square. So white doesn't want, if we're going to trade pieces on d5, we don't want to be left with a position where we play knight d5, pieces are traded, and we have a pawn. So for instance, let's just make some moves that clearly aren't the best moves to illustrate this point. So let's say after bishop b3, we play something like knight to d7. We play h3, and now after b4, we go knight d5. Then after this series, maybe we want to go bishop first, and maybe after bishop takes, knight takes, e takes. This is clearly a worse version of the game. So this isn't fighting for d5 at all. This d5 pawn may or may not be weak for us, but we don't have any good outposts anymore for our pieces. There's no more holes in the black position for us to sink into. Like maybe we can reroute a knight to c4, but I have serious doubts that we can make anything serious out of this position. So we actually want to avoid these situations where where we take back on d5 with a pawn. And you'll see most of the play in the game really revolves around this idea. Now, so clearly, for anybody in the comment section here, all those moves I made there were quite bad. I know this, but it was just for illustrative purposes only. So let's come back to b5. We retreat with the bishop to b3 because, again, we don't want to trade things on d5. And black makes this really just bad move, it seems, like a strategic mistake. I'm sure there was a deep idea that Anand maybe had in mind for this, but it really, it's counter to the basics of the position, I think. So here, Vichy actually took on b3. And the reason this just seems to be such a bad move is it actually helps white achieve their strategic plan. They're taking away a defender of the d5 square, trading off the light square bishops, and leaves us with only 2 more sets of minor pieces for us to trade off to where we can control d5 entirely. The typical move in these kind of positions, this is a well-known theory, the typical move here is h6, whereas play might go like rook fd1, maybe knight bd7, a3, queen c7. And this is going to be a long, very, very complicated game where it's going to be very hard for us to fight for the d5 square because we can't play bishop g5 so easily. So this would be a really complex game to play. But what happens here after bishop takes b3, a takes b3, is black never really has the ability to play the move h6 because the bishop on e6, as well as defending d5, it also is playing an important role in defending the f5 square. So there's lots of lines where black might play h6, and I simply play knight h4, knight f5, and whip up a really quick, nasty attack on the black king. And so it turns out like h6 is never really possible in this game, and it's maybe it's a point that was missed by Vichy, but I don't know. I haven't seen any of his comments or annotations on this game. Right now in this position, we definitely cannot play h6 because white has this silly cheapo knight takes b5, taking advantage of the fact that the rook is pinned along the a file. So black's next move, knight bd7, makes a lot of sense. White simply is going to go here. They go rook f to d1, just trying to put the rook against the queen. I think bishop g5 is also quite a normal move here. But Polgar decides rook fd1 is the right first move, excuse me. And now Vichy sidesteps with off the d file with queen c7. So to illustrate the point I was making earlier about the move h6, so if black goes h6, we have this move knight h4. So now I'm aiming for this really nice square on f5. You can't play g6 because clearly bishop h6 is bad. And here we could try the line b4, trying to unprotect e4. We can go knight a4, I think, knight e4, knight f5, and then now maybe like, I don't know, we can just come back like this. But even here, all of a sudden white can actually already have ideas of taking on h6 and playing this position, and I think that this is probably winning for white. And so out of nowhere, white can actually drum up a really nasty attack with such a positionally desirable move, but it's also a blunder. So it's clear here, if you go through some of these lines and analyze this, that black actually never has the time to play h6. So the move queen c7 makes a lot of sense. And now white has the time to now execute the plan we talked about. We're going to play our bishop to g5 to trade off one of the knights. Then we'll put a knight on d5, trade off a pair of knights, and be left with a knight versus a good knight that can go to d5 versus a very bad bishop on the dark squares. And so this gets really fascinating. So black, part of their strategic trumps in this position is the half-open c-file. So they want to make sure or try to dissuade us from playing knight to d5 by putting pressure along the c-file and pointing out to us that, hey, if you move this knight, this pawn on c2 is quite weak. And so we might actually have to make some concessions. Maybe, they're thinking I might have to put a rook on a really passive, crappy square, or put my knight back on a passive square. So, black is still fighting strategically here. They're not losing or out of this game by any stretch of the imagination. But some of the ideas here that Polgar finds is really cool. So the move knight e1 looks maybe like it is a concession. I'm moving backward, and my knight looks like it's not doing anything great on this square. So why is this such a good move? Well, the idea is one, obviously we're going to control the c2 square. That's really important. But the other deeper positional idea behind this, like all these 2700 level players, they make moves, all of their moves have a purpose and have energy behind them. They're never just playing passive moves. They're always trying to make sure that their moves maybe defend, but also have an attacking idea behind them. So why knight e1? So what happens here is once we say trade off the dark square bishop for the knight, play knight d5, rook d5, our knight wants to actually travel to d5. But from f3, the only way that it can get to d5 is actually through the e1 square. So it would have to go maybe knight e1, knight c2, b4, d5, or from e1 to c2 to e3 to d5, or maybe through g2, e3, d5, right? So there's many options, but all of them actually start with the move knight e1. So this move actually has quite a bit of energy behind it, even though it looks passive. So I was very, very impressed with this move when I saw it. So black can't really, they can't prevent us from trading these pieces. The knight is pinned to the bishop on e7, so they go for queen b7. So queen b7 is just trying to maybe put some pressure on the e4 square. Maybe they'll play d5. There's no way that they're really going to ever get d5 here. So, but I just think it's to maybe put a little pressure on e4. They could have maybe tried b4. But after the same idea here, you're left with a position that it's pretty much similar. We're going to try and relocate our knight through g2, e3 to d5. We'll play our rook back to d2 to defend this pawn. But maybe this position was slightly better than the game, and you'll see why, because this b4 pawn actually helps restrict this weakness on c2, as opposed in the game, what we're going to get after queen b7. Now we simply take on f6, knight d5. So now we're going to try and trade off these knights so that we're going to get this imbalance of my really good knight versus this really bad bishop. So the game proceeds like so. But, the guy playing black is pretty damn good. He's world champion in, 4 or 5 different formats. Just an unbelievable player. So he's not going to take this lying down. So what black argues is if I'm able to trade off your pieces on the d5 square, then that results in you taking back with a pawn, then I'm completely fine. Actually, my bishop may end up proving itself to be stronger than your knight in that position. So what black does here is plays the move rook c5. So yes, they're threatening to win a pawn, but they're also just trying to exchange pieces on d5 and with the hopes that we have to play ed5. So Polgar will have none of this. She'll play rook d1, and we trade off a pair of rooks, and rook c8, activating this piece. So in the previous position we saw, why I thought maybe the move b4 was slightly better, was that this b4 pawn can actually help keep our c2 pawn as a weakness, and take away maybe options of the knight coming to c2 to e3 to d5. But in this position, Polgar plays the really nice move c3. And c3 is actually aimed against the move b4. Like if you play b4, which is what happened in the game, then we can simply play c4. And now I have plenty of space in my position to play knight c2, e3, d5, maybe I'll put him g2. And there's really no more pressure on the c file. So you can see that the move queen b7 was probably inaccurate, because black needed to keep this pawn on c2, I think, to hope for, any semblance of something that looks remotely like counterplay. So now black plays the move g6, just trying to maybe get some luft for the king. Maybe someday they'll play f5 or h5 or something. But here white is actually in no rush to try and get their knight to d5. And in fact, if they go too quickly, they may find themselves getting in some trouble. Here, I think knight c2 maybe is possible already, but black actually has maybe one defensive idea to play against the knight coming to d5. And the idea here is that if the bishop can appear on g5, while this pawn is not hanging, right? Our pawn is hanging at the moment, but if it can appear on g5, it would love to just sit on this diagonal and trade off this knight anytime it appears on e3, because the only roads into d5 at this moment go through the square e3. So black's idea, also with g6, is maybe I'll come to g5, or if I have to, I'll go through f8 into h6 to try and control the h3 square. Now, unfortunately, there's reasons why this doesn't work out, but it is something that you should consider in your games, that you may think at this point you already have a strategically winning position. I'm just going to simply route my knight to d5 with no problems. But there are ideas for black here to fight against this plan, so you do have to be careful. And as part of this, this next move I just found really impressive, and it's a type of move that grandmasters make very easily. I think the computer recommends this move right away, but it's the move g3. And the point of g3 is actually to fight against this bishop g5 idea. So I could maybe play h4 and grab more control over the dark squares on the king side. It also gives me the ability to go to g2 to e3 if needed be. And it also gives my king a little lift. I can maybe play king g2 and get ready for the king to enter the game if it has to. So I thought this is a really just impressive, improving move without having to change the position drastically. It's something that these players are super strong at. So Vichy goes and plays rook c5. So again, he wants to play rook takes d5 so that we're forced to put a pawn on d5, and white will struggle. They'll have an advantage maybe, but they'll struggle to actually do anything real. So clearly white cannot allow that trade, so we drop back with rook d1, and now pawn to a5, just maybe expanding on the queen side. Maybe they want to play the move a4 and bust up the white queen side structure. But we're just going to play now, I think, too quickly for black to handle this. So now Polgar goes for knight c2, aiming one move closer to get our knight on to d5. And now king g7. Now when I did this lecture in person, Some people asked here, well, what if black tried to play bishop g7 now to play against this? Well, the pawn on d6 is hanging. So we could try, instead of king g7, which seems like a waste, we could try and engineer a move which will protect all the squares at once. So let's say we played a move like queen to c7. Well, already I can just jump into e3. So it's just, they're just always one move too short to achieve this plan. It's unfortunate. So Vichy goes just for king g7, improve the position of the king, and also playing for a trick here to point out that we can't play knight e3 right away, actually, because our e4 pawn will hang. So in the previous position, the point was that we could try to play a move as black that if we try to defend d6, we also want to make sure that e4 also hangs to prevent knight e3. So the only move which will achieve that, I think, is maybe queen c6, but that just allows us to drop right in. So nothing fast enough. We can't ever play bishop g5. So after king g7, we just want to make sure that our e4 pawn is not hanging anymore, so queen d3 is pretty natural. Now rook c6, defending this pawn so that they can at least release the bishop to go, well, do next to nothing, because it's a pretty bad piece at this point. And now we go knight e3, queen c8, and we could go knight d5 right away here with a tempo on the bishop on e7, but white decides in typical grandmaster fashion, let's actually just maximize our position before cashing in on all of our strategic trumps. So they go king g2, and now the game becomes a bit of shuffling and maneuvering pieces, where white is just going to start probing for weaknesses in the black position, and it's actually really instructive how she does this. So we'll flip through a few moves here. Just queen e6, queen e2, bishop d8, knight d5. So now we finally achieved our plan. We've got this really great knight on d5 playing against this really bad bishop on d8. But that doesn't win the game right away. It's probably strategically winning. But the hardest thing to do in chess is to win a one game. Because even though this bishop is really bad, it can protect the a5 pawn, which is one of their only weaknesses. It does control some of the weak dark squares here. And, d6 is not going to be assailable at all. So white actually has to be pretty creative in finding a way to break through in this position. So what Polgar does is decide to just probe the position a bit and see if they can find some entryways in ways that forces black to maybe make some concessions or put their pieces on awkward squares. So we have black shuffles with rook c5. They're definitely not going to sack the exchange on d5. That would just be really bad. But it overprotects a5. It also shuts down potential entryways for the moment for my queen into the queen side. And so we're just shuffling. Now here, obviously, after bishop e7, it'd be a huge mistake for us to go knight takes e7. Even though they're left with this weak d6 pawn, I mean, this knight is worth 3 of these bishops. I mean, there's no comparison. So in no world, unless it wins immediately, in no world is white considering this trade. So Polgar decides to put the rook on d3. We're actually going to try and double on the d file so that maybe someday I will take this bishop and crash through with rook takes d6 and win the game that way. Well, but black just comes back, queen d2, rook c6, defending that d6 pawn, queen d1. So again, just we're maybe going to switch to light squares. Maybe I'll come to f3, and we're just going to see how is black going to react to. We're just passing the move, saying how are you going to defend. So black comes with king g8, and so now what white proceeds to do here is based on the principle of two weaknesses. I mean, we do have our positional trumps, but black doesn't have any real weaknesses that we can attack yet. So what she's gonna do is start to create one on the king side, And then once that happens, she'll create another one on the queen side and break through there. So she starts with the move h4. The idea is simple. I'm just going to play h5, crack open your king side, and then maybe put my rook on h1, get my queen somewhere like h2, and try and checkmate you. Which is really nice, and it sounds really good, but we're not going to be able to win with just trying to attack on the h file. It's just not enough at the moment. So, but it's a really good idea. We're going to create a weakness there so that we can find one another place on the board, so we can break through. So black is stuck kind of shuffling their pieces. So king g7, now we go h5, bishop g5, is putting the bishop on a more active square. And we come, I don't know why there's an arrow there, but we come with queen to f3. Sorry, I guess let me erase this errant arrow. So the idea with queen f3 is simply to transfer the rook to d1 to h1. So black again is kind of shuffling back, waiting for white to show their hand. Rook d1, rook c6, and now the move queen to e2. So queen to e2 is a really cool move, and in the lecture, I guess I used the same PGN file. I kind of gave the idea away here. So what white wants to do, obviously we're going to play rook h1 and try and create some threats on the king side. But in order to generate our second weakness in the position, we need to find where our possible pawn break is coming from. And the only other possible pawn break in the position is the move c5. So in order to even think about that move, I need to control the square c5. And clearly, you can't play rook c1. So what white decided to do was to move the queen to e2. We're going to play the move f3 and queen f2, which threatens to enter the queen on the queen side. And if you try to stop that, maybe with some defense where you put your rook on the 7th rank, I can then play c5 and break the position open, where the difference between this knight and bishop will be amazing. And this is exactly what happens in the game. So rook c8, and the idea here now with rook c8, it's not just shuffling. Black wants to transfer their rook to from c8. They're going to come to b8 to b7 so that they can defend laterally. So when we take with the h-pawn, they're going to take with the f-pawn, and the rook will be nicely placed. And the rook is also going to try and stop the queen from infiltrating on any of the dark squares that are here. So it's a pretty nifty move. But Polgar plays a simple rook h1, king g8, f3. So we're proceeding with our plan to maybe someday enter with the queen here or play c5. Rook b8, which is the plan I just mentioned. Queen f2, rook b7, and now we take on g6. So what's the question you should ask yourself here in almost any chess position is, one, do I have to recapture? I think here that's a pretty obvious yes. But how do you recapture? We're taught always to capture towards the center. So I think the natural move here would be hg6. It's not so clear maybe how white is going to mate me. Well, it will be in 1 minute, because if hg6, white has this really cool looking move, queen g1, with the idea of just coming to queen h2, and I actually don't think there's a way for black to defend this position. So because of that, black has to play back with, take back with the f pawn. It also opens up the rook to defend the h7 pawn that way. So I mean, obviously fg6 is superior, but it's against what we're kind of taught as kids. So now white is in time to play the move c5. And now we're going to break open the queen side. And we're going to have entryways now for our pieces to come into the c file. So it was black who owned the c file at the beginning of the game, and now it's white who owns it now. So after dc5, queen c5, we do some repositioning of our pieces here, where white now they want to just get control of the c file with the rook in front. And now the queen comes to c1. And what's really cool is you can see that this knight, it's just radiating power, controlling all of the squares the bishop wants to be on. But it's in controlling this really important c7 square where the rook can't actually challenge the c file at all. So this is just dominating and strategically winning for white. I think a computer, when I put this on it, evaluated this as marginally better for white, but I don't think there's a human on the planet who can defend this position. I don't think Magnus himself could defend this as black. It's too passive, the knight's too strong, and there's now too many weaknesses in the black camp. So Vichy goes with h5, trying to give himself some space, some extra options of playing king h7 in positions where he needs to. And we go rook c6. Okay, so this I consider to be significant progress, right? I mean, look at how active white's pieces are. We have this weakness on a5. I mean, the e5 is also a weakness, and look at how pitiful black's pieces are. I mean, they can barely move. So this is really cool, even though there's not a clear win yet. So we can't actually see a clear win, and that's what positional chess is kind of about, accumulating all of these small to maybe not so small advantages till a point that your opponent cracks. So here Vichy actually finally cracked. He made a move that on the surface looks absolutely fine, but in reality it's actually kind of a blunder, because he plays king h6, putting his king on kind of a vulnerable square. And you might think that you're just going to shuffle your king back and forth, and it might have been fine had we gone to h7 or something, but h6 is now vulnerable to queen e3 check and giving white an extra tempo. But it doesn't really work anyway right away, because if we go queen e3 check, the king moves back to g7, our rook is still hanging on c8. So what white does here is kind of a tricky little move with rook to b8. And the idea of rook b8 is actually, if black does decide to play something like king g7, that we're going to play rook to b7, deflecting the queen away from this rook, so that we can enter with maximum effect, and now the e5 pawn is ours, and this should be a pretty easy win for white. Maybe stronger than rook b8 actually was the move rook to a8, just because I can now play rook a7 where it's defended by the queen. But nonetheless, it seems like rook to b8 was good enough. So in this position, Vichy plays bishop f6, and now Polgar, I mean, her imagination is incredible. And when I saw the ending to this game, and I saw the last move, and it said 1-0, I thought it was a mistake in the score. I didn't understand. I didn't see the finishing tactic right away, but it absolutely demonstrates the power of this really strong knight in this position. So here, Juda plays queen to e3 check, and now seemingly this is a bad idea. I mean, bishop g5 looks like it's holding everything down, but Polgar finds this amazing f4. And when I first saw this, I just didn't get it, because here on e takes f4, if we take back, then the move queen g4 should be drawing, or maybe even better for black. I mean, now our king is really uncomfortable, and now the bishop might come to h4 or something. This could be really difficult for white. I think they would just at a minimum have thrown the win away. So what's the point after e takes f4? Well, here Juda plays the amazing rook to h8 check, and Vichy resigns. And I just didn't get it, because I was like, well, what about just king g7? Doesn't this just attack the rook? My queen's attacked. I can't take back here because of queen g4. What's going on? So in typical fashion, if you want to pause here your video and see if you can find the finishing moves, it's really something, and it shows that the amazing imagination that Judith had probably all the way back when she played rook to b8. So the idea here was that the game is over after queen d4 check, bishop to f6, and now the stunning queen takes f6 check. After rook takes, we have rook h7 check, so x-raying to the queen. And now when we take here, check, and I take the queen, and this is just a very simple piece up win for white. But it all actually happened because white induced all of these weaknesses on in the black camp because of the immense disparity between the strength of the knight on d5 and the bishop on e7. It really was truly remarkable. I mean, we can flip through the game again really quickly just to talk through and make let these ideas sink in. So again, once we get to this position, both sides are playing for a control of d5. White wants to put a piece there, and black would love to be able to just play the freeing move d5 themselves. We go through, obviously here we can't, black doesn't want to trade on c4 because it helps accelerate our plan of putting bishop g5 and a knight on d5. So we get in this position, and here Vichy played the odd anti-strategic move here of bishop takes on b3. So now our plan here is the simple bishop g5, knight d5, and we're going to put pieces on, put a piece on the d5 square. And that's exactly what happens in this game. So we go to bishop g5, knight d5, and now we've got the piece in balance that we want. And then white slowly, very slowly improves their position to the maximum potential, gets their knight onto d5, and now once they're here, they kind of apply this principle of two weaknesses. I'm going to create the first one on the king side with h4, h5, and I'll create the second one by threatening to enter on the queen side and then pushing c5. So we go through here, there's just some shuffling, trying to see what black will do. Now we pry open the king side, threaten to come over there. This idea of f3 forces pretty much this idea of rook b8 and rook b7 to prevent the queen from entering in the queen side. But this allows us the idea of c5. And now from here, it's just a really slow death for Vichy until he finally cracks, and Juda just finds an amazing tactic to end the game. So I thought this was an absolutely incredibly instructive game played by two of the strongest players of the world at the time. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this, and I hope that I see you guys again at Metro West next Tuesday, and hopefully you'll actually get the live lecture next time. Thanks, guys.